The question is that the words proposed to be admitted stand as part of the question. I call the member for Fremantle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad to make some comments on this bill, which we support. It does make some positive changes to the way copyright and brand protection is given greater security, and it's something the wine industry has wanted, so it's welcome by the wine industry. As was said when this was introduced, it's adding one more tool to Wine Australia's export controls toolkit by creating this wine export label directory, and it does ensure that all the hard work that people go into developing a strong reputation for their product and for Australian wine across the board, and the wine that comes from all of the 65 different identified regions in Australia, that value is properly protected in terms of copyright and brand reputation. It is incredible to reflect on the strength of the industry. 2,500 wineries, as I understand it, 6,250 grape growers, 150,000 employees one way or another across those 65 wine growing regions. Australia, the 13th largest economy in the world, is the 6th largest wine producer and the 5th largest wine exporter in the world. I think of Western Australia, as I'm sure you would, Deputy Speaker, and we have 9 fine wine regions, and while we only produce 5% of Australia's wine, which surprises me a little bit. I usually use the 10% rule for WA, so I feel like we can perhaps look to go a bit better in future. But we come back, I hesitate to use that term actually, but we come back into the reckoning, Deputy Speaker. We come back into the reckoning by virtue of
$15 million.
Yeah, that's right. By virtue of the fact that Western Australia produces 20% of Australia's premium wine. So only 5% of wine by volume, but 20% of Australia's premium wine. And I'm advised we have collected 30% of Australian wine medals. So that's not too bad. I did live in the southwest in Margaret River in the late 70s, and so I got to see a little bit of the transformation that has occurred in the southern part of the state, because the wine industry in Western Australia was established in the Swan Valley. I think the first vines were planted at the beginning of the Swan Colony in 1829, and then that part of Perth, or sort of northeast of Perth, developed to be quite a strong wine producing region in the fairly early going. And it wasn't until the 50s and 60s that grape growing and wine production really shifted south. And Margaret River, I mean, when I was there, moved down there in 1977, there would have been a small handful of producers. I think the first sort of meeting at which the Margaret River region was sort of kicked off, the meeting I think occurred actually in Busselton. It was in '66. So by the time I was there, it was only 10 years old, and there weren't that many. Well, my word, it changed fast after that, and spread from Margaret River into the Great Southern, and you've got all these different regions: Manjimup, the Blackwood Valley, and so on. And if you go down there now to a visitor, it would, particularly the Capes region around Margaret River, you would sort of almost feel that wine production is one of the most dominant forms of economic activity. Not least because when we think about the wine industry, it's not just about what they produce and what they export, but most of them have kind of public-facing, restaurants and cellar operations and places for people to come and visit and pick. And so in that way, it doesn't, when we think of its export value, it's not just the $3 billion of exports annually, but it's also a really big part of our tourism industry. So as a sort of a service export, as an attractor, and hopefully we see that kind of come back to how it has been. I know, it's a plague. It's what happens. It's subliminal. That's obviously how it's supposed to work.
Wait till I get the soundtrack.
Yeah, I'll probably I hear it too often. Something else will happen. But We should reflect while we make this change, and it's good that it gets done. It's clear that it needs to be done in calendar year 2020, and here we are in the last week. It's occurring. The wine industry will welcome it. It's been a really, really tough 12 months. The wine industry was affected by bushfires 12 months ago. The bushfires themselves are an aspect or related to the impacts of climate change. We know that climate change is making our climate, broadly speaking, hotter and drier, and increasing the frequency of weather events and bushfires. I know that at one point the anticipated impact of smoke taint was really quite significant. In the early going, I think Australian Grape and Wine Incorporated thought it could be as much as $40 million, and New South Wales Wine estimated a $100 million hit off the back of the bushfires if you included the tourism impact. So that was significant. My understanding is that since those estimates were given, the impact has turned out, certainly in respect of smoke taint, to have been a bit less than that, so that is welcome. With respect to climate change more broadly, obviously that's not unrelated to bushfires and the things that can produce, but it is having a broader effect, and it's not, the way that it affects the climate is not always going to be the same. I actually have visited a couple of the vineyards in that Capes region. The Margaret River region, parts of the Margaret River region are getting a little bit more winter rain and sort of on the shoulder of the cool wet season in WA than they used to, and that is not helpful for some of the varieties that are grown there. But generally speaking, the hotter and drier conditions will put the industry under pressure. Australia, for a range of cultural and historical reasons, has tended to favour varieties that actually going into the future probably aren't the best. There are other varieties that are better suited to hotter, drier climate. The difficulty is, and that sort of brings back to the point of this bill where we're talking about brand value and reputational value, is once you're established as a particular region and you're known for particular varieties, it's pretty hard to suddenly shift and pull up vines. I mean, not least the cost and the time it takes to get back to high quality fruit production, but just the fact that you've become known for your Chardonnay or your Pinot Noir or whatever it happens to be, you suddenly then shift to varieties that might be more sustainable and more productive in the long term. You've also then got to do that cultural, reputational brand shift, and that's something obviously I think government, state and Commonwealth should look at. There are producers, I know companies in the business that have already begun to almost sort of move their fruit south, essentially, whether that's probably in the Western Australian terms further into the Great Southern. I know in some cases to Tasmania, because people are reading the tea leaves on where the climate is going. The other thing we all know that the industry is dealing with at the moment is related to trade, and it is of concern that China has decided to apply tariffs of up to 200% on Australian wine. I don't think anybody can point to a reason for the imposition of those tariffs. There doesn't seem to be any fair basis for the application of those tariffs. They will have a significant impact on Australian winemakers and exporters. They already are, and they will. And that will hurt those producers. It will hurt their workers and their families and the communities in which that production occurs. And as we know, that they are regional and rural parts of Australia, where often wine production, sales, exports and associated both local and international and intrastate tourism has actually become one of the more dominant features of the local economy. So to have it hit on multiple fronts, but now through the imposition of these tariffs to the biggest single export destination for Australian wine really hurts. The wine export industry, 62% of our wine is exported, $3 billion worth. China is far and away the largest export destination, 1.26 billion, which is about 42%. And it's 25% of what China imports, which is, I think, interesting. In terms of other Indo-Pacific destinations, in the top 10, New Zealand, Singapore and Japan. New Zealand's about 100 million, so Singapore, Japan half that at 50 million. that gives you a sense of how important China is. India presently is only $6 million worth of wine. Now that does constitute 20% of their wine imports by value, so we're not that far. Like if we contribute a quarter of China's wine imports, we contribute about a fifth of India's. But clearly there's so much room to improve that through our export facilitation, and I think also whatever we can do within India to help bring the joys of drinking wine to the emerging middle class in India. And on that, I do endorse what the Shadow Minister for Trade has said about the importance of diversification and the fact that we haven't made nearly as much progress with respect to India as we would all like. India and Indonesia are the two markets that are really underdone. If we think of what's happened vis-a-vis China, that's fantastic, but there are great opportunities in India and Indonesia, and that should be the case for wine, and we need to put more effort into making that happen. Settling trade agreements by itself is not enough. You need to put resources into trade facilitation, and we should be doing that. More broadly, I just note that all bilateral relationships work best on a foundation of respect and open but thoughtful communication. We don't have that with China at the moment for one reason or another. It does take two to tango in all relationships, and I think we can look at how we've got to this situation, which is for a range of reasons, and the fault is certainly not entirely on Australia's side, but in trying to look to how we repair it, I think we can acknowledge that we can do more to re-establish the foundation of that healthier relationship. There's no question, absolutely no question, there never will be, that we should pursue and protect our national interest as shaped by our national values. But anyone who thinks that that's simply a simple matter, an uncomplex matter in a region that is undergoing significant and complex geostrategic change doesn't know much about history or diplomacy, to be fair. And anyone who thinks that Australia can best pursue and protect our national interest by stamping our foot or banging our hand on the table should look up diplomacy in the dictionary. We do need to be clear-eyed and resolute. I personally don't think that clarity and strength of resolution is supplied by some of the kind of look-at-me gang conduct that we've seen from self-described wolf warriors or self-described wolverines, for that matter. Sometimes in our bilateral relationships, we will need to be flexible and patient. Sometimes we will need to be firm. There will be differences of view between Australia and other nations, including China. That has always been the case. That will be the case in future. Some differences we will put aside. Some we will seek to resolve, and we should do that thoughtfully, respectfully, purposefully, and diplomatically. It's crucial that key relationships are conducted with care, stability and consistency in accordance with a sensible long-term approach. And on that basis, without romanticism or idealism, but also without undue pessimism, let alone antagonism, our relationship with China can and should be one of mutual benefit and of regional benefit, not just economically, but in terms of supporting all facets of peaceful and sustainable development, regional security and human rights. We recognise that China's economic miracle has helped enable Australia's best self in terms of trade and the stability of our national economy. And in the friendship between the people of our nations, Australia should always be prepared to enable China's best self, and that progress for both of our countries through our bilateral relationship, the regional and multilateral fora in which we participate, and our shared interest in the rule of law can only occur through shared effort. I hope that's the path we return to in 2021. I wish the government well in making those efforts. It's important for Australia's trade, which includes wine and other products like crayfish out of Western Australia, but the importance goes much, much wider than that. I think we all recognise that. So, Deputy Speaker, as I said at the outset, this bill makes a small but positive and welcome change to the wine industry at a time when wine producers and their workers and all involved in the industry have faced a very tough year. Unfortunately, it's not over yet, and we do need to make sure that we continue to look at the key areas of difficulty, especially in relation to climate change, bushfire risks, and our existing trading relationships and opportunities to diversify export markets.